Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name's Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Welcome to Food Safety Fridays. Hooray, we're back. And today we're going to be talking about Supplier Approval Intelligence, the next evolution, with Chris Domenico from Safe Food 360. First, just a few housekeeping things. Today's webinar, as always, is being recorded. We'll send you an email afterwards to all registrants with the slide deck, the recording, and the certificate of attendance. So don't worry if you miss a bit today. I can see already you're all typing in the sidebar. Let us know where you're joining us from today. It's great to have you along. As we say each week, we bring you these short bursts of education and get you a certificate every week free of charge. And that's thanks to our kind sponsors. And I'll play now the sponsors' messages, and then afterwards we'll join and say hello to Chris. But for now, I'm going to quickly play these. We'll be back in just over 2 minutes. Okay, see you shortly.
The world of food has changed a lot in the last 100 years. But one thing that doesn't change? Ensuring the quality and safe handling of food. No matter what changes are yet to come, we're proud to always be on our clients' side, shaping the future of food, today and tomorrow. AIB International, ever onward.
There we go. Thanks to the sponsors there who sponsor Food Safety Fridays. Now, let's meet Chris. Are you there, Chris? If you can switch your webcam on and your mic.
Hello.
Moment of truth. Morning, Chris.
Morning. How are you? And hello, everybody.
Great to have you along with us again today, Chris. Have you been monitoring the chat in the sidebar?
Yeah, I've been seeing. I see we have people from all over the place today.
Literally all over the world, and 331. So not bad. Okay, let's get your slides up and let's get this show on the road. So there we go. I'll be back for the Q&A later. If you can switch your webcam off, Chris. Okay, and then we can get going. Over to you, Chris.
All right. Well, thank you, Simon, and again, good day to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and from wherever you're coming from. During today's discussion, we're gonna take a look at supplier approval, and we're just gonna go beyond that, and kind of beyond what you may have understood previously. We want to kind of grab a hold of this concept of supplier approval intelligence, and to understand why it's critical that we gather intelligent data regarding our suppliers as we conduct modern approvals in today's climate. And looking at the shared concerns that we have globally, 1 in 10 people are affected, and more than 420,000 people die from foodborne illnesses every year. Food fraud, just in the UK, it costs more than 12 billion pounds annually. I've actually seen statistics that are saying like the US dollars, putting it at globally about 30 to 40 billion dollars per year, and for the food industry. So in food recalls, these are increasing. You simply just need to go to your legislative websites, and you can see the information on this. The recall processes themselves are inefficient, and the learnings that we're getting, they're rarely shared. The companies aren't quick to put that information out. There's increasing dependence on a global supply chain to source raw materials, partially processed products. So I note specifically here in the U.S., we're not simply just sourcing products internally here in this country. We're actually sourcing outside of the U.S. as well, and I know that's a global issue. It's a global challenge. There's increasing food trade volume and pace. So we are increasingly the volume of the food trade. It's increasing on a daily basis. The complexity of the borders, these are ever increasing. And the varying country food safety standards and capability. This past week, I happened to be at a conference in Canada, and this is actually very evident. Looking at simply the standards, you look at the Safe Food for Canada Act, and you look at that as compared to the FSMA standards. While there are similarities, you can actually look at those standards side by side and see just those two standards. There is quite a bit of variance in just those standards, especially when it comes to the supplier requirements. And then there's the food chain operators themselves. There's a vast majority of them are your small to medium-sized enterprises. But the major challenges then, we need a full visibility of supply chain data, and then the cooperation across interested parties and stakeholders. We need secured permission systems and interoperable, usable, and affordable technologies. We start to look at some of these things. I speak with hundreds of companies on a daily, on a weekly basis, and some of the questions that constantly get asked of me personally are, those systems, those solutions that we sell. Can we look at them? When we log in them, are they conformant with our country's standards for secured access? Are they conformant with 21 CFR Part 11, and what have you? Not only that, but then these solutions, can we even afford them? Are they going to fit our scope in terms of the budget that we have? So we're going to look at some of these things as we go through today's discussion. But why do we need to approve our suppliers? Well, our certification bodies require us to have effective supplier approval programs in place. The legislation, such as FSVP, requires us to ensure that we're working only with approved suppliers. And it's simply good business practice to work with other like-minded businesses, other companies who share the common goal to provide safe, quality foods to our consumers. The GFSI standards, the BRC, for instance, the company shall have an effective supplier approval and monitoring systems to ensure that the potential risks from raw materials, including primary packaging, to the safety, authenticity, legality, and quality of the final products are understood and managed. FSMA, the FSVP requirements, require us to have to put in place standards and controls in place to ensure our products. And then our retail technical standards, they're requiring us to have effective controls in place and to only be supplying effective products and to the manufacturers. If we look at the typical supply chain, this slide represents a typical food supply chain. You can easily see here in this slide that there's risk at each step within that supply chain. So it's really a simple matter of fact that the more complex the supply chain, the greater potential there is for risk, or simply put, the risk potential increases the greater your supply chain. So you are responsible for identifying risk at each step along the way here in your own supply chain and ensuring that you have sufficient controls in place to mitigate those hazards. The supply chain management process, typically, it's a simplistic process here. You collect the data, you're going to assess the risk. You determine a particular set of controls, and then based on that, you can make the decision to approve that supplier or not approve that supplier. But then if we're going to approve that supplier, then there is a particular monitoring that you're going to put in place. And then essentially now you're going to repeat that process. And based on your requirements, you may, and it may be every year or every 2 years, every so many years, but essentially, you're going to repeat this process. Now, let's think of this in terms of the amount of suppliers that you have, and this is really all relative based on the size of your company. If you are a small company, this might only be a small group of suppliers, 20 suppliers or upwards of 50 suppliers. But then, if you're a large company, this can well go into the thousands of suppliers. And so, this can either be a small task or this can be quite a cumbersome task, and it all depends on the number of suppliers that you have. But an approval process, a robust approval process, this actually should be upwards of an 8-step process, essentially. So, if we look at the assessment details in step 1, you want to determine the information that you're going to require from your supplier in order to properly assess them. So, what is that assessment information you're going to need to collect? And what are those documents that you're going to start to collect? And we'll have a little bit of information about what type of documents you might want to go ahead and collect from them. But essentially, maybe you're going to get a questionnaire, or maybe you're going to start to collect those certificates and the type of kosher documents and what have you. Essentially, what is it that you're going to need to get in order to be able to say, okay, this is they say they are a supplier. We need to collect particular materials from them. What are we going to need to have in order to what type of data are we going to need to be able to collect in order to approve them? And then in step 2, that's our data collection step. And this is the step we're going to collect some information from them, and depending on your level of advancement, some companies they may be collecting data via an older method, maybe it's snail mail, maybe you're collecting it via fax or even email. But then some companies they might be employing a more technologically advanced method. Maybe you have supplier portals, for instance. But once that data is then collected, you're going to be collecting, again, the information that you've determined in that step 1. You're then going to move on to step 3, where this is where non-conformances, CAPAs, you're going to essentially collaborate with your supplier. Should discrepancies in the data collection stage in stage 2, essentially you're going to have some corrections where you're going to allow that supplier, you're going to give them the opportunity to correct that data. You're going to collaborate with them. They might have, maybe there's some incorrect data or insufficient data has been supplied to you. Because move on in step 4, where there's a risk assessment that you're going to be taking place here. Now, what's important to note here is that this assessment is going to take place in the absence of controls. The assessment here we're going to take a little bit of a look at here in a little bit here, because what risk assessment model might you be using here? Are you going to simply be using like a 5x5 codex matrix, rating a probability against a severity, or are you going to go to what you should maybe be using, like a criteria-based risk assessment model? Again, we're going to dissect this a little bit and look at this a little bit further in greater detail. However, what's really important here is that this risk assessment that you're carrying it out in the absence of controls. Now, once we conduct this risk assessment, this moves us on to step 5, where we're going to now determine the controls that we're going to put in place here based on the risk assessment. Now, this risk assessment, or the determination of controls rather, we've collected the data, we've conducted the risk assessment, and we've now determined, okay, we now understand there's a hazard, there's risks that are determined to be present. So now we can determine, we can effectively determine the controls we can put in place to sufficiently mitigate or control that risk. And in step 6, we're simply going to we can document those controls. We can codify the controls that we need to put in place to effectively control those hazards or those risks. In step 7, now we're going to conduct that risk assessment in the presence of those controls that we've now determined. We said, okay, back in step 2, we've conducted that, we've collected the data, we went through, we corrected it, we had that opportunity to collaborate with our supplier, and we've corrected all that information, we've determined the risk. And then we've determined which controls we needed to put in place, and now we're going to, in the presence of the controls, and we can now conduct a risk assessment. And this risk assessment it actually now should be much lower, because now we're effectively controlling those hazards. And at step 8, we can now approve that supplier or not approve them based on that. We can now have that final determination stage based on all the information gathered, steps 1 through step 7. The requirements, essentially, on the food businesses need to have in place those processes to address the specific requirements. The data collection, businesses need to collect data from entities within your supply chain. And these are documents, the certificates, there's questionnaires, statements, control plans, the risk assessments that you're going to complete. These are risk assessments of the food businesses, the individual facilities, products, agents, brokers, importers. Determine the controls based on the data and the risk assessments, the subsequent risk assessments. Food businesses must determine the appropriate controls to manage the risk and then repeat it. Now, it's important that and this goes back to the whole thought process of, back when you were initially going for maybe your GFSI certification or AIB, whatever that initial food safety certifications were, the first mountain that you're climbing is, we got to get that certification. But that's simply just the first mountain that you climb. The second mountain is maintaining that certification, and much is the same with your supplier approval. That first mountain that you're climbing is approving it. The second mountain is, we need to repeat that now. They need to maintain that approval. So that second mountain is repeating that process. And then it's going to repeat in subsequent years. We talk about those documents that you needed to collect in that collection phase. Some of those documents, and just a few of them, and this is not obviously not an exhaustive list, but some of them, you want to collect that, the food safety plans, maybe the GFSI certificate, the Declaration of Food Safety Compliance, an allergen statement, on through their co-certificate, continuing guarantee, quality guarantee, environmental policy, and an org chart. We're going to take a look at these things. Now, you may have, depending on your sector, there's maybe additional documents that you need to collect from that particular that particular supplier. Talk about the risk assessment model that you're going to be conducting, or when you're going to conduct a risk assessment. Which risk assessment are you going to use? Are you going to simply just carry out a simple 5x5 codex matrix? That's appropriate when you are conducting your HACCP plan or your food safety plan. It's appropriate then. But when we're looking at our supplier approval programs, it's more appropriate to, in our supply chain, it's more appropriate to utilize a criteria-based risk assessment. And in that risk assessment, each one of the criteria, it should be weighted because each criteria will contribute more or less to that overall risk value. And as we apply that then, it's going to then provide that true risk within that supply chain, or within that, as we carry out that risk assessment. Some of the criteria, what's appropriate for you? Some of the criteria, and I'm going to actually leave this slide up. I believe we're making these slides available, but I'm going to leave this slide up so that you can actually have you can copy this down. But some of the sample criteria that's used by companies, you may want to use this information as you build your own risk assessment model that you want to utilize as you conduct your risk assessment against your suppliers. Are they GFSI certified? Has that supplier or has that facility achieved third-party certification standard? Do they have a certificate of guarantee? Does the company issue certificates of analysis? What's the country of origin? This criteria involves referring to public databases on the history of food safety from particular countries or regions, including the likelihood for food fraud. Has the company had a recall in the last 24 months? Very important. Measuring the number of recalls, alerts, notifications, withdrawals, sanctions over a recent period may indicate the level of risk with a particular supplier. Threats or food defense, a measure of the potential level of threats in the supply chain, food fraud, adulteration. And then also then want to take into account the total volume of supply. Each one of these criteria, then, of course, you're going to want to weight this. You want to weight these because, again, each criteria that you're going to utilize here is going to contribute more or less to the overall risk value. Of course, if they have a very small volume of supply, it's not likely going to matter whether they're issuing you certificates of analysis. It's of course it has to make sense. And it has to be, it's all going to be relative to you. So just going to, again, allow everybody to take maybe you're going to take a screenshot or continue to write that down and just give just a few more seconds. And then I'll move on. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide now. Some of the challenges that we face, again, and this is going back to the data collection, the task of collecting essentially the volume of data. And pardon me. The task of data collection can be a major challenge. It's emerging as a major issue for most food businesses. Simply just just how are you going about collecting the data? How are you going about requesting the information from your suppliers? That can be a challenge. Communicating this, typically, and primarily, this is a lot of the communication is done via email, or you're making a phone call, or what have you. This can be a very time-consuming task, but it's a burden on human resources within your company. And there's very little value add for a company in this particular area. And then again, you go back to those assessment models. Which assessment models are you going to use? And go back a few slides here I showed you exactly what should be a criteria-based risk assessment model that we're using. But then more importantly, the resources that we're going to apply to this. Really adding additional resources, adding more human resources to this. It's no longer really a viable option for companies to simply just throw more people at this, because companies, our budgets are not growing immensely, so we just don't have the opportunity to throw more people at these problems. So how are we going to face these challenges? One of those areas is a pre-assessment, okay, or one of those areas where we can combat this or combat the resource challenge is a pre-assessment. What is a pre-assessment? A pre-assessment allows you to drill down into your supply chain as far as you need to, but you still are able to maintain your relationships with your suppliers. Look at the typical supply chain model, and the approval model, where you go through and you conduct that approval. You have that full assessment. Well, prior to even conducting that full assessment, what if you were able to collect some pre-data on your supplier? And because we all know, well, sometimes there are those suppliers where, regardless of the data that you're collecting, regardless of the information you're collecting, there's nothing that you can do to be able to approve some of those suppliers. There's no way you can twist it and turn it and flex it, and they're just not going to ever get approved. So what if you're able to collect some data ahead of time and actually just kick them right out of your supply chain, right? That's what a pre-assessment might allow you to do. Some of those benefits that you're going to see. A pre-assessment, it allows you, before you even engage in those activities, before you even spend a nickel on further engaging into a full assessment, you can make that determination. Do I want to even invest another nickel into going further into this process? The initial assessment can be conducted based on some basic data on that supplier, and then allow data on other entities such as facilities, agents, and brokers, and data to be collected, and then a decision can be made regarding triggering further assessment of these entities. So we want to have that essentially that pre-assessment. About supply chain mapping and what have you. Supply chain mapping and intelligence allows you the benefit of knowing who at various tiers in your supply chain. It allows you the benefit of knowing the what for any individual supply chain entity at any given moment in time. And this is delivered to you by real-time data. It requires real-time data. Supply chain mapping, it's extremely difficult if you're using a spiral-bound notebook and Excel to manage your supply chain. You need the benefit of real-time data. Given our audience, and I'm not sure how many of our audience members are actually auditing their suppliers. But Supplier auditing may be a scheduled event, or supplier auditing may have been a triggered event that was arisen due to a poor outcome. Going back to the supplier approval process a few slides ago, I remember it was like step 4, the risk assessment. You determine the control determination may have been that you're going to audit the supplier. There's a further evaluation to determine essentially you're going to control them, effectively control the hazards. Auditing the supplier provides you with the opportunity to further assess the suppliers against legislation and global food standards. You can collect evidence as part of your intelligence gathering, and then you can collaborate with suppliers and team members. As you build your supplier scorecard, there are specific standard requirements for scorecarding, and the supplier scorecard. It's very interesting. This is where individual companies may all be doing something different for developing the scorecards. You might be using a scorecard system that you built out in-house, using an elaborate computer software program, an Excel program, or perhaps you want to purchase a software program. Essentially, on a scorecard, you want to provide the supplier with a report card of how you've scored them. And this would be based on specific criteria, and you would have gathered evidence during your approval process, and you want to report to them on that. And this is kind of in the basic kind of, we're going to distill this down. So some of the criteria you're then going to report back to them on this scorecard. The receiving information, complaints, historical assessment information, current open actions, CAPA information, and the certificate information, what have you. And essentially, you want to weight all of this information, and based on that, then provide them with a final score so that we can then score that supplier, and essentially give them that final score or a final rating for them. And then once we've effectively have then completed that supplier approval process, an effective supply chain map provides you with a look across your entire supply chain. The requirement for us here, it's not simply to draw out a pretty map. I think back to my own personal time, going through a GFSI certification. I was being audited, and one of the requirements was to complete a matrix, and this is many years ago, and I utilized some graphics, and I drew something up, and the auditor looked at me and was like, "Nah, that's not what I meant," so we can get fancy with this, and we can draw something and completely miss the mark on it. So the requirement here is not simply to draw a pretty map with pretty colors in it. It requires a bit of intelligence for us. So we need to look at any given entity at any time, and we need to be able to ask important questions, like, do they have a history of food fraud issues? As our supplier, are they coming from a high risk country? Are they GFSI certified? If we followed our process in steps 1 through 8, if we conducted those pre-assessments, if we developed those scorecards, if we conducted our supplier auditing, if we et cetera, if we kind of gone through this process, we'll have no problem developing a robust and an intelligent supply chain map. That it comes down to the challenge is how you can practically develop your own supply chain map. There have been technological developments that can assist, and that are going to help. And there's heard of blockchain, the distributed ledger technology, secure cloud technologies and platforms, smart contracts, payment on evidence of compliance. There's been big data analysis and modeling, smart manufacturing, tagging and tracking, holographic labels and smart packaging, sensors, temperatures, whole genome sequencing and DNA speciation and stable isotopes. So it's just some of the technological developments in really just the past few years. Given the nature of the challenges that we have in this one area, it's clear that technology is the only thing capable of solving these challenges in the medium to long term. What that's going to look like, it's an open question. What we know is the way we have done things is that's not going to be the answer for us. And just what we know is we need to be able to get our hands around what's been an extremely cumbersome task, and it's only going to become more cumbersome in the future. And technology is going to be what helps us. Where we go is, again, that's going to be it's an open question, and it's for you out there to continue to investigate. And I see the time, and I see we're finishing up quite early. So Simon, I'm not sure. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I see. We're actually very, very, very short.
No problem. There are some questions in the sidebar, so it gives us plenty of time to pick up on those. If you want to switch your webcam on, Chris, we'll pick through the questions. Let's have a look. Okay.
Oh.
So, yeah, I've highlighted one there from Cindy. Can you see that in the sidebar, Chris? It's quite a long question. I'll read it. Regarding criteria, what about having an established long-term business relationship with a supplier with no food safety incidents? Is that a valid criteria to consider in a risk assessment? If a supplier has provided safe food but doesn't have GFSI certification, should not be penalised. So what about track record? How does that fit into the risk assessment?
Absolutely, it should certainly be a valid consideration. How they have previously, and how your company has previously worked with them. That absolutely would be one of the criteria. I think I should point out that the criteria that was on there. And I believe if you went back to that slide, that was some of the criteria that was used by companies, and it's not a be all end all. This is the criteria you should use. It was just a kind of a sampling of this is some of the criteria to give you an idea. But I believe that right there is something that should even be added to that list, because that's an excellent point. So I would actually put that in with the criteria.
Yeah.
Because I think the history that you have with that supplier means quite a bit.
History, relation
to how you're going to operate with them in the future.
And relationship.
Relationship with the supplier.
You know, if you have regular meetings with them and things like that, regular contact, all those things.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Objective and subjective criteria. Ellen, what about things that you buy, like a chemical from Home Depot, off the shelf? How do you manage supplies like that?
I had an auditor tell me one time, don't do that. There's one-time purchase, provisions, certainly that you can have, but number one, I know we should be able to, from a reputable chemical manufacturer, be able to source information and be able to source the documentation from the manufacturer themselves. However, you're also looking at go back to some of that criteria of the volume of the supply you're getting. You normally are not going to be getting a massive truckload of that chemical. So you're getting typically a very small amount, but it's a one-time purchase and what have you. So you have to kind of go into and conduct a risk assessment on that. Okay, is this, what are we doing, and like kind of utilize some gray matter in what you're doing and apply that to, is this worth it? Because at the end of the day, your label is the one that's going onto this food that's going out to the human consumers. It's not the chemical that you're purchasing at the store, and is it worth it for your company to actually do that and make that decision?
Okay, Bria, you mentioned that there were some standard practices of scorecarding. Can you share some of these standard practices for scorecarding?
Standard practice, I might need a little bit of elaboration on that. As far as the standard practices for compiling the information initially, or for we actually provide some more data as far as the publishing of the information. I guess I'm not quite sure exactly what the question.
Yeah,
and it might just be my own mental block there.
Okay, Bria, if you can just expand on that, we'll try and pick it up. Shanna, do we need to have supplier approval for secondary materials such as boxes and slip sheets? Things that are not ingredients or direct food contact packaging. Things like secondary packaging, and how do you deal with that?
Typically, that a lot of that comes down to your certification, like who your certification body requirements would require or would specify, or your legislative requirements would be, and a lot of those are requiring approval on those. So the answer, there's typically like a best practice would be, you would. I wouldn't go down to approvals on things like office supplies or like bathroom supplies, things like that. But certainly like food contact materials and packaging materials and things like that, absolutely.
Yeah,
you want to have approval information on this.
On for example, BRC packaging standard, there are two levels. It's right, isn't it? There's the higher hygiene level, which is for direct contact packaging. Then there's the lower hygiene, which would be for secondary packaging, slip sheets, boxes, etc.
It's based on your certification requirement.
Yeah. Let's have a look. Heather just made a point that supplier approval is a challenge for a distributor where the customer, restaurant chain, has already selected and contracted with the manufacturer. Just by the way, Chris, before when you said how many of you carry out supplier audits, I don't know if you noticed that I did run a poll. Did you see that? No.
No, I didn't.
All right. Well, the result was...
I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I just put a question in the sidebar, a poll actually. Do you audit your suppliers? And 75% do, and 25% do not.
Oh, good. That's actually higher than I expected. Yeah, that's actually that's actually great. Yeah.
I mean, how would you go on, Chris?
It's actually much higher than I expected.
Sometimes with global supply chains now, it's not always possible to audit suppliers. I mean, do you have to, in your opinion, do you have to audit your suppliers?
No. You don't have to audit your suppliers, and there's plenty of customers who or plenty of companies, I should say. I misspoke there. Many of companies that don't audit their suppliers, and they'll accept the GFSI certification, or they'll accept some third party certification in lieu of that. So it's certainly, I mean, if a company is not providing something like that, then perhaps you'll want to, or based on that approval process that you're going through, and there's some sort of a poor evaluation that might trigger that and say, okay, well, there's certainly reason why now, based on the data that I've collected, and then I've risk assessed them or what have you. Now, based on this information, in order for me to go ahead and approve them, now I need to go ahead and approve and provide that audit, or I need to go and conduct that audit. There's a reason for that, but it's costing a fortune, and for us to be able to remain solvent as a company, we can't go out and audit every one of our suppliers, or we'll not have any money to effectively run our business. So
I suppose, Chris, as well, it comes down to if it's a new supplier, then obviously there's a higher risk because you don't know about them. But like Cindy was mentioning before, where you've got a sort of a long history,
the history,
the relationship,
you may not need to,
and it depends on some part.
I previously worked one of the companies that I worked with. For every new supplier that we had, we actually went out and audited every new supplier in order for them to be approved. There's a questionnaire that they had to fill out, and we actually had to go on and audit every new supplier. That was just the way that it was. So as part of the approval process, initial approval process.
Yeah. I've just highlighted another question from Cher. What types of documents should we gather for packaging materials or other raw materials that are not food but are food contact? So what types of documents should we gather for packaging materials?
There's a host of documents that you might and I aside from your guarantees and have to provide and I'm not sure if you're able to do that through here, but we could certainly provide a best practice list through IFSQM. But I don't have off the top of my head, I can't provide that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, things like, obviously you mentioned before, if the GFSI certified certification and things like that, but specifications and nowadays, obviously, migration testing is chemical migration testing for the materials and things like that to make sure they fit for the product and process. But yeah, if you do have a list, Chris, we can circulate that after the webinar recording and slides. John is asking, how can we approve a distributor?
How can a distributor be approved? You want to a broker distributor, and you want to approve. I mean, you have to. I believe you want to. It depends on where's John coming from. Is John coming from? I can't see that on that. I can't see that.
When you say where is it coming from?
Depends on where exactly you're coming from. Geographically, I mean, is he coming from? And essentially, you approve them as you would regardless of being a distributor or what have you. You're approving them as you're doing an individualistic approval. So approve them much as they share, or they own the product in the time they have that product. So you're essentially you're simply just going to approve them. You're simply going to approve them based on that period of time that they have the product. So there's not like a less I should say there's not less that you need to do for them that you would do for for any other entity.
I suppose as well, Chris, that the beauty of GFSI standards now, they're not just for, let's say, food manufacturers. You've got packaging manufacturers, storage and distribution. So you don't have to make up sort of the expectations. There are already well-published standards available that they should be following and certified to. So I suppose that's a way of proving.
Yeah, and ensuring they have their certification. Yeah. And as long as they've been approved to that, and part of your approval process, do they have their GFSI certification? And as long as they can provide that, that's part of their, okay, they've got that. And then you can assess them against that simply.
Dr. Ahmed El Masalmi, can we apply supplier approach for food processing equipment? Yeah, supplier approval and management is for anything, isn't it, Chris? Any supplied product or service, I guess.
Can we apply the supplier approach for food processing equipment? You can. I mean, this is specific for supplier. The approach is quite similar. However, I would think that you would want to go a little bit deeper in your processing equipment. But and I guess that depends on where you're coming from as far as like if we're talking about approvals of your processing equipment, yes. However, I believe that the premise to answering that question is yes. However, there's if you're approving yes, the answer is yes. However, we want to go a little bit deeper in your processing equipment once we get that in your system, because we want to do your HACCP evaluations in the system or in your manufacturing facility then.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Alonso, can you recommend any software for handling quality management systems like internal audits, document control, training, etc.? Do you know any software, Chris, at all?
Sure. Yeah, let me think here. Let me think.
Oh, what's it say on your mug there?
Offhand.
I missed that.
It said
yeah.
It said Safe Food 360 on that mug there. That's one in particular that I could think of. That's about the only one that comes up to mind at the moment. But since this isn't actually a plug, I would certainly say that's the best one that I know of. And that one's one that covers a full gamut of everything.
I can vouch for them as well, and you'll find a link on the slide deck that we send to Safe Food 360 website. And just on that, on the Safe Food 360 website, you'll find a wealth of resources on there, such as blogs, white papers, downloadable white papers on very detailed and useful white papers on a lot of food safety related stuff. So you check out the links in the PDF that we send you afterwards. Okay, there's a nice little plug for Safe Food 360. Right. Let's also, is GFSI an absolute requirement for a high-risk supplier like ingredient supplier? What if the supplier has a food safety management program, HACCP, risk, etc.? All of these PRPs, so they've got everything, but they're just not GFSI certified. What do we think?
GFSI isn't the, I mean, it's not a total, I mean, it's not the, if they're not, that's where you want to have a weighted, that's where you put your weighted score in your, is it for you? And that's part of your own, and your own approval process, you know, and is it your own, you know, for you to have your approved supplier, is it required for you? And so is it worth, you know, is it 50% requirement that they are, all of your approved supplier, or your suppliers are going to be GFSI certified, for you to be able to work with them? If so, then it is a requirement. However, it may not be absolutely required that they are. Certainly it's not, if they're not GFSI certified, doesn't mean, well, you cannot work with that supplier any longer. And if they meet all of these other requirements, can you still work with them? If they don't have it, then perhaps then what you may want to do then is and have another step in there. Well, then we're going to control that by this. We're going to then conduct an audit or what have you. Or maybe it's that they develop a particular risk, or they're this, but they're still going to be an approved supplier under this condition. And that's the whole process of your approval process. They're going to be conditionally met, what have you. So just because they didn't carry that GFSI certification doesn't necessarily boot them right out of your as they're now non-approved supplier simply because they're not GFSI certified.
Well, one thing on that, Chris, is GFSI now, the fact that it's proliferated throughout the globe, it's becoming increasingly difficult to stay outside that. But also, it's not just a cost burden. Standards and certification to standards are a mechanism for continual improvement because they're evolving all the time. They're adding new bits into them. So that does ensure that a supplier is forced in a way to keep up to date and keep improving their system. So, you know, they've got to get on the wagon at some point, I would say. Just one from Hamid there. I'll answer that.
It's actually more and more difficult to find one that's not. Yeah.
Hamid's just asking about migration testing there, which is specific, and it's something that I'm quite familiar with. It is a high annual cost, Hamid. There is no real need to do it annually unless once the initial migration testing is done, unless the specification changes or the process changes or legislation changes, annual migration testing is not necessary. So you don't need to demand it. 3 to 5 years is what they say. Most people, there's no set time. Corey, must the company physically visit and audit its suppliers, or would requirement and review of GFSI audits suffice? Have we covered that?
I think we covered that.
Yeah. Let's have a look. We're not going to go on to VASUP and TASUP. Can you see any questions there that you want to pick up? Because we've not got much time left, Chris. One there, Gary. Let's have a look at that. When performing supplier audits, do most companies create their own audit form based on perceived risks with that particular supplier, or follow-up of a GFSI audit scheme? So I suppose it depends, does it, Chris?
I believe it really depends, and it's typically my suggestion is typically to create a hybrid quite honestly, because you might have your own criteria that you would use, your own checklist that you're going to go down and as you walk there, everybody wearing harness, beards, everybody following GMPs, that type of thing. And then are you also following these particular protocols from a particular standard or something like that, so that you can then ensure that they're meeting those criteria, those set of requirements. So.
Okay. A few people have been asking to get that list that we mentioned before.
The best practice list for packaging materials?
Yeah.
Is that, am I? Yeah, okay.
Okay. Oh. I'm just scrolling through the comments trying to see if there's a question, a final question. Key, see, some of them are repeats, but key, what if a small, medium company buys from a non-GFSI supplier overseas and this company is not able to conduct supplier audits?
Is there another way you can?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, Chris, it's what you said before. The ideal goal would be you go and visit new suppliers, go and audit. But if you can't, you do everything you can, in terms of gathering intelligence from them.
Yeah. And if by overseas you mean Hawaii, I'm free to do audits in Hawaii. So just call me and contact me.
I thought you were fed up with traveling, Chris. You make an exception for Hawaii.
For Hawaii, yeah, and Caribbean Islands. I'm good to go to Hawaii. Caribbean Islands.
Okay, right. I think, ladies and gents, we've passed the hour. We've answered some of the questions. We've had a good 20 minutes on the questions, but not answered them all. But thanks very much, Chris, for your time today. We'll follow.
Thank you all.
We'll follow up with the audience with the slides and recording, etc. later. So thanks very much, Chris. Have a good day. Speak to you soon.
Yep, you too. Yep, take care.
Okay, ladies and gents, I'll just load the certificate of attendance in the sidebar. You click on the download now button. That takes you over to Dropbox, where it's a PNG, so it's an image file. You then can print and sign that, or you can open it in an image editing software and type your name and put that in your file with all your other 126 Food Safety Fridays certificates. You must be a clever lot by now. Okay, thanks very much for your time today. It's been a few weeks since we had a Food Safety Friday. I think it's another couple of weeks before we've got the next one. So watch your inbox. We'll send emails about that. Enjoy the rest of your day. It's Friday. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care. Bye.